All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm so glad that you're joining us. And for those of you who are joining us live, good morning to you. You'll have a handout this morning that's called the Overview of Ezra, which is what we're doing this morning. And if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, we send that out to you every Sunday morning. So if you have subscribed to our newsletter and you'd like the handout, that is in your email this morning. And we're working our way through the Bible. I'm enjoying going through each book and highlighting each book, and I hope this morning is a help to you. For those of you who are watching online, just to kind of explain this too. Our first hour we do is an overview of each book is what we're doing right now. It's a little bit more academic than you'd hear in a normal sermon with application. Our second hour, we're going through the book of Genesis verse by verse, which is a little bit easier to digest, a little bit less information. So that's just the way these two are designed if you're following along. And I think there's a benefit to both styles of teaching, of course, but just so that you know what we're doing. We're continuing in the book of Ezra this morning with our book overviews, and I'm excited to be at this point of our study because I think this is part of the study where I see most believers, and I'm kind of using myself as a template, where I was probably the most confused growing up, and I just had trouble putting the pieces together. You kind of get to Ezra, you don't know what time period. Ezra's a little earlier on in the Bible, but its actually timeline is talking about the last parts of the Old Testament. So just as a way of review, remember when you're going through the Old Testament, we have, once we get into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles is an overlap basically of 2 Kings and on. But remember we have, you have the patriarchs where you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you get to Joseph as a main focus at the end of Genesis. And then basically you have Moses as a main focus all the way to the book of Joshua. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are all covering Moses and the story of Moses. His predecessor there is Joshua, and he takes over for Moses. And then you're going to see him all the way until the story of the Judges, where we see that 400-year cycle. And after the story of the Judges, then we see them get their first king. And when you see that king, then you have, remember, Saul for 40 years, David for 40 years, Solomon for 40 years. And then after that, remember, we see that kingdom divides north and south of the divided kingdom. After the time period of the kings, you remember during that you have the Assyrian captivity, 721 BC. This is all recap, so hopefully this makes sense. You have the Assyrian captivity, and then after that, the captivity from Babylon, the Babylonian captivity. That's the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. And remember, Daniel is at that time period. He's writing it at Babylon. Remember, Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, is writing lamentations about how Israel has been destroyed, Jerusalem's been destroyed. Well, it's during that time period in the book of Daniel and the captivity of Babylon. That captivity lasts for 70 years. At the end of those 70 years, as it was prophesied, some people start making their way back to Israel, a very small minority. It was only about 40,000 people or so out of a vast, large number at that point made their way back to Israel, as was prophesied that the Lord would bring them back in their land. That is the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's how the Old Testament closes. The Old Testament closes with their return back to the land and a rebuilding of the temple and the law reestablished, and the Lord used Ezra in that capacity. So Ezra and Nehemiah are that same time period. That's the story of the return to Israel after the Babylonian captivity. So this is really, we're reading the end of the story. This is also parallel with the story of Esther. So Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, put those together in your mind, along with a lot of the minor prophets, Zechariah, Haggai. These are all together the same time period, and in your mind's eye, they're at the end of the Old Testament. Okay? So having said that, let's dive in. The name of the book is Ezra. Of course, this is named after the primary figure. And we'll get into who he is a little bit later, but he is a scribe. He's also a priest in Israel. He worked with Nehemiah to organize the return of the Israelites into their land after the Babylonian captivity. Anybody remember the king who started the Babylonian captivity? King Nebuchadnezzar. That's that story of Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, so that's the same story. This is the same time period of that, okay? In Ezra, we talk about these people being referred to as post-exilic Jews. Just, you can see here the word exit, exile. Exilic means they're leaving. This is after they left. The word Ezra, or the name Ezra, means help. And he certainly was a help and perfect for this time period. This is book number 15 out of 39 numerically, but remember, in your mind, this is chronologically at the end. There's only 10 chapters in Ezra, and remember, and I'll say it every time we get together for this, remember, 5:12, 5:5:12. 5:12, 5:5:12. We're in that first 12 in this. You have that first 5 is the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the Torah, the law, the Pentateuch. Penta means 5, Tuch means volumes, the 5 volumes or the 5 books. 5:12 is what we're in right now, that first 12. Those are the books of history. And we are right now in the 10th book of 12. That's where we're at in this story. And so that actually, doesn't that make it easier to think through? We're at the end of the history books. So you think, well, why isn't this at the end of the Old Testament? Well, we're at the end of the chronology of the history books. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So it is in chronological order if you think of it in the 5:12, 5:5:12 pattern, because we're in the historical books and we're at the end of those historical books. And so if that's why I always emphasize the 5:12, 5:5:12 pattern, because it is in that, if you look at the breakdown of those categories. So that may be a help for you to think of it that way. So why isn't it at the end of my Old Testament? Well, it's at the end of your history books. So think of it in those. Remember, this thing that we're holding that we call the Bible, the book, this is a library of 66 books. So you wouldn't go to the library and say, well, this book's out of order. No, that book is self-contained, and it may be on a shelf that's organized, and then that whole row in the library may have a different organization. So Ezra is at the end of the historical section. It's one book on that row that's at the end of the history section. In that sense, it is in order. It is in chronological order, if you think of it in those terms. Here's a visual for you with the 5:12, 5:5:12. So you can see it just after Ezra. We're down to Nehemiah and Esther. The big red arrow indicates you are here. Right, that's right, that's right. So you see that in the mall, you know where you are according to Auntie Anne's and the pretzels. And we have those here, right, in Florida, Auntie Anne's? I don't know. When I was little. And Orange Julius, is that still a thing? That's probably not a thing anymore, is it? Remember the Orange Julius at the malls? That's the only reason as a kid, I wanted to know the big red you are here arrow. Okay, great. If I'm here, where's Orange Julius? That was my big treat when I went with my mom to the mall as a kid. What's the general theme of Ezra? Well, the book of Ezra picks up where 2nd Chronicles leaves off. And as we already stated, I'll go ahead and state it again. Remember, the southern kingdom was captured and destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. They were there for 70 years. Now, I'm going to let you in on an insight here that will be, if you've never heard this before, I'm not overstating this. If you've never heard this before, life-changing for your understanding of the Bible. That's right. I'm making that claim. Here's what it is. In this time period, if you remember, so Jeremiah goes and he starts weeping. He's called the weeping prophet. He writes the book of Lamentations, means crying. He's lamenting. This is when King Nebuchadnezzar takes away a bunch of people, and we call the Babylonian captivity, 586 BC. Okay, during that time period, we have prophets writing, we have Daniel writing. Remember, 70 years, there's people born in Babylon. So imagine this. We're all taken away from America or wherever you're watching this. We're taken away from our homeland where we speak English and we have American culture. And we're taken away for 70 years into, let's say, Japan, just another culture, okay? A strong culture. And remember, we all think back and we remember what America was like. You and I would have memories. We would say, remember this thing. Remember we did it this way. But keep in mind, we're going to have children born in Japan in our scenario. Those children have no connection other than you to American culture. Their first language will be Japanese. My sister lived in Japan for many years, and she had one daughter that was born in the States, blonde hair, blue eyes, and when she was very, very young, they all moved to Japan. So she had two daughters that look like me, born in Japan, the fairest of them all. And their first language basically was Japanese. And they would speak English in their home to try and make sure they knew English, but they're just as comfortable speaking Japanese as they are English. And culturally speaking, they're way more adapted to Japanese culture than American culture. They moved back to the States here, I guess about 3 years ago now. There's a major learning curve for the three girls that had never experienced, other than very short-term vacations to come home, American culture. You had that going on in the Babylonian captivity. And do you know what? When it was time to go back to Israel and rebuild the temple, guess who wanted to go? The older folks. They want to go home. Guess who had no interest in going home? Their home was Babylon. So you have the vast majority. I've done the study before. I think it's something like 3 or 4% returned. So here's the thing I said was life-changing. All of the prophecies written by Haggai, Zechariah, they are prophesying, and Ezekiel, they're prophesying a return to the land by the people of God. When was that written? During the Babylonian captivity. When was it fulfilled? In Ezra and Nehemiah. Why is that life-changing? Because the vast majority of political pundits today and the vast majority of Christians are waiting for the Jews today to return to Israel. They missed what Ezra and Nehemiah is about. It was fulfilled. When? You're reading it. How many times can it be fulfilled? Once. So why would you still be waiting for it? It'd be like waiting for the Messiah to come. Some people are. We believe he did come. He was born in Bethlehem many years ago, 2,000 years ago. I'm not looking for another Messiah. It was fulfilled. Just like I'm not looking for the prophecies of Israel to return to their land in my future. It was fulfilled in Ezra and Nehemiah. That is absolutely radical new information for a lot of people, but that is the reality. So when you read about the potential temple in Ezekiel 40 through 48, and people are saying, oh man, this is going to be in our future because we don't see it. No, read chapter 40 and 41. Ezekiel's temple was based on their obedience to return to the land. Did they? No. It's a potential. If you acknowledge what you've done wrong, if you embrace Yahweh as your Savior, if you embrace these things, this could be your reality. Did they? 95% said, nah, we're good, and did not go back to Israel. It was the older folks who had already reached some of their children that made a return. And it was under their leadership of a man named Zerubbabel that they rebuilt the construction of the temple. And those older folks saw the temple and they were sad and said, this doesn't even compare to the first temple. The younger ones had nothing to compare it to because they had never seen it. And 95% of them decided to remain in Babylon. If you got that, it was worth you coming this morning. If you got that, it's worth you watching this video. That information just doesn't seem like it's taught very much. So I think that's good information for you to know. Let me go ahead and read this. I basically already said it. Ezra begins at the end of these 70 years and records the history of some Jews, most decided to stay, to the land of Judah. King Cyrus of Persia was used by God to call God's people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and the temple. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, that's our construction guy, that's our architect, the temple was built. Once they are there and rebuild, God uses Ezra as a scribe and priest to instruct God's people to remain pure before God. What's the time period? 537 BC to 565 BC. This is a span of 72 years that covers the proclamation from Cyrus, king of Persia, the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple, and the instructions given to the people of God to remain faithful. Where's the scarlet thread? Well, I kind of already mentioned it, but let me explain. How do we see Jesus in this story? Well, remember, the end of the story is Jesus replaces the temple. Remember when Jesus in John chapter 2 looks up and he's kind of looking through the temple and he goes, hey, by the way, destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. And he's kind of looking up at the rafters and everything. And they're like, 3 days? Does this guy not know how many decades it took to build this temple? And Jesus said, if you destroy this temple, well, he wasn't very clear, was he? Because he wasn't talking about the building, although he was in the building, looking at the building. This meant this temple referred to his body. They missed it. And so we needed a temple system in place because Jesus was going to come and replace the temple system. Remember, the Judaic age, the Jewish religion, if you will, biblical Judaism, I'm not talking about rabbinical, but Old Testament biblical Judaism was replaced by Jesus Christ. And so he's the one that became the new temple. And so no temple, let me say it this way. I try to say it the same way. Judaism is a temple system. No temple, no system. Jesus replaced it. So the importance of Ezra and Nehemiah was to rebuild the temple so that one day Jesus could come and be the replacement of this system. So he couldn't have it defunct in the mid-500s BC. We needed a functioning temple for when Messiah came to replace the temple system. It was defunct because Christ replaced it covenantally, not because somebody came and destroyed the building. So that's the importance of this. You can read this in Ezekiel 36 through 48, 48, for example. We talked about that a second ago. The purpose of this was to reestablish God working through the temple system. This was important because Jesus replaced this system with his kingdom. Kingdom. All right. Very important. Here's significant characters you might encounter in the book of Ezra. This is a little bit in order here. Cyrus, the king of Persia. He's an important figure. By the way, let's hit pause here in our minds. Do you remember the story in Daniel chapter 2? Remember the story of the image? A lot of times we have the image laying on its side, but it was really an image of a statue going to the heavens. And it was an image of the top had a head of gold. Do you remember this? And that represented a timeline starting with the kingdom of Babylon. And Daniel's interpreting this for Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar's going, I don't know how to make sense of this thing. Well, it was successive kingdoms. It went, the head of gold was the Babylonian kingdom. And then it went the Medes and the Persians. And then the Grecian Empire. And then finally the Roman Empire. This is the historical timeline starting with the book of Daniel. Or I could say the Babylonian captivity and the successive kingdoms coming to the point of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. So you have the Babylonian Empire, Medes and Persian Empire. Cyrus was a king of Persia. So we start seeing the Persian part of Daniel 2 taking over from the head of gold, Babylonian Empire, to now we're seeing the king of Persia is in place. Of course, that's going to be taken over by Alexander the Great as he conquers the known world between Malachi and Matthew. We call the intertestamental period, about 400 years. The Grecian Empire, you hear the word Greece in there, Alexander the Great, the Grecian took over the world, and that's when the world became a word that sounds nothing like Greek. It became Hellenized. The Hellenization of the world, which means the world became Greek in thinking and in culture. That's when the Greek language took over. Of course, then that's taken over by Rome, the Roman Empire. Side note, which is a Latin language. You say, well, why didn't they speak Latin in the first century? Why was our Bible written in Greek and not Latin? Do you remember the answer? Rome doesn't care about their culture. Rome's not trying to push their culture on everybody. The Grecians did care. You're going to think like us. You're going to do math like us. We're the smartest people. You're going to do philosophy like us, Greek philosophy, Greek gods, Greek medicine, Greek numbers, Greek language. You're going to all be Greek. Rome said, hey, man, you be who you want to be. If you're peaceful and you pay taxes, more power to you. Give us money and be peaceful. And they had what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And they ruled with an iron fist and said, everybody play nice and really have whatever language you want. Latin was their official language, but Greek ruled the day under Alexander the Great. So here it's very important when you see the Cyrus, the king of Persia, because you know in your mind, going to Daniel 2, we're in the next phase of the Roman Empire. or of the successive kingdoms, I'm sorry. By the way, since we're on the topic, you remember the end of that dream? The end of the dream was, I see Babylon, Medes and Persians, then you're working your way down to the feet, then you see the the Grecians, and then the Roman Empire, and then there's a mixture of the toes, that's clay, that's like Israel mixed in, but it's faulty. You wouldn't want your feet to have instability. There was instability throughout the Roman Empire with the Jews at the toes. But remember the story? Then Daniel sees a little stone made without hands coming off of a mountain, just this little pebble. And in his mind's eye, he sees this little pebble goes over and puts a hairline fracture on one of the toes of the giant statue. So a little made without hands pebble comes in this successive line of kingdoms and has a hairline fracture on a toe. No one thinks anything of it. We stub our toes all the time. But this little hairline fracture grows and grows. And finally, the kingdoms topple over and you go, wow, how did that happen from this little pebble? You look back at the little pebble and the little pebble starts to grow into a great mountain. That's Daniel 2. Do you know what the little pebble is made without hands? That's the virgin birth of Christ. Christ is the little pebble that topples the kingdoms. Why? Because in our timeline, Jesus starts his kingdom at the toppling of the Roman Empire. You want to go watch the History Channel? I love doing this for fun. The History Channel, they have PhDs upon PhDs of people trying to figure out how could the Roman Empire have fallen? Oh, how it was so mighty. How could it have fallen? I'll tell you the answer. The Christians made the Roman Empire fall from the inside out. They would not go along with the immorality of the Roman Empire, and they could no longer sustain their rule over people with a moral conscience. And so they tried to work with them. That's where you get the Roman Catholic Church from. Constantine basically said, let's compromise. I can't get you to throw away babies anymore, like was legal and nobody had a problem with. Totally legal to throw away your baby if you don't want it. Passing by a dumpster, hear somebody crying. Oh, they just didn't want them. No big deal. Christians got the Holy Spirit in them and said, we aren't doing that anymore. And they called it a bookish religion. Did you know you're a bookish people this morning? That was how they made fun of Christians, because you wanted to read and be literate. And because of the reading of the Word of God, promoted literacy in the world. And the Christians started that. We became the weirdo nerds who had a book in their hand. And we started to have reading groups and teach people how to read. And you became known as bookish people. And so this changed the Roman Empire. They got a conscience and a morality guide and knowledge. And so finally Rome said, if we're going to have any power here, we better compromise with these people. And they got all the people in one big room and they stirred the pot with the Christians and the pagans and everybody else. And they stirred the pot. And Constantine said, okay, now we can have peace again in the Roman Empire. And they stirred the pot with all of these beliefs. And out of that came Roman Catholicism. There's your crash course this morning. Zerubbabel. But Cyrus made a proclamation for the people to return. A very, very important proclamation. Zerubbabel, he was a leader of the exile. He was a chief architect. Think of him as, he's your Bob Vila. Zerubbabel is Bob Vila. All right, he's this old temple. That's just Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the guy in charge of this. He's like, what we have here is an old brazen altar, dust that off. So that's Zerubbabel. He's the chief architect. In charge of rebuilding the temple. Now, something interesting too is this man's name is Jeshua, very, very similar name to Joshua. In fact, it may be the exact same name in the Hebrew. He was from the line of Aaron, a Levite, and he was the high priest at the time. So he's working alongside Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is overseeing the construction of the temple. He's working with the high priest, Jeshua, which is, by the way, probably the same name as Yeshua, Jesus, Savior, but the same name. And he's the high priest at the time overseeing the priestly duties. Believe it or not, in Ezra chapter 5, you meet two prophets named Haggai and Zechariah. They're in the book of Ezra. Of course, they have books that bear their own name, but you have these two. These are the prophets of God to the people in Judah. They have books with the same names. Number 5, you have Darius the First. Now, he's also a Persian king, because remember our timeline in Daniel 2. The Babylonian, the Medes and Persians. It's important historically. We know these things. He was the one reigning at the time the temple was rebuilt. Now, here's a very important name. Artaxerxes the First. Very, very important. He's also a Persian king. And if you look in Ezra chapter 4, he wrote a letter. Now, when this group, they came in waves from Babylon. There was a first wave, there was a second wave, and some trickled after to come back. During the first wave, they started to rebuild. King Artaxerxes in chapter 4 wrote a letter demanding the stoppage of the construction of the temple. Total says, you guys, we're not doing this. In the past, read the letter. It's very, very interesting. The letter is, in the past, you guys have had people that have demanded taxation from everybody. We're not doing that. Stop the rebuilding right now. I think that was part of the Lord, because in Ezra chapter 7, he then writes another letter that commands the work to resume on the temple. The reason I think that's of the Lord is because if you remember, there's a very, maybe the most important prophecy in the Bible is in Daniel chapter 9, what we refer to as Daniel's 70 weeks. It's a 490-year prophecy. And it says that you start the stopwatch for 490 years at the command to rebuild Jerusalem. So I think Artaxerxes stopping everything officially, because there is Cyrus, there's other proclamations. Which one do you go by? Artaxerxes says, you better stop everything. It's all stopped. And then there's a nice clean break. And then in chapter 7, Artaxerxes writes another letter, a second letter, commanding the work to resume. But not only that, he opens up his royal Chase account, his royal Wells Fargo account, and says, and by the way, if you need anything at all, you get a hold of me, I will help fund all of it. And he opens his royal checking account and makes sure the temple can get done and Jerusalem is healthy. Chapter 4 says stop. Chapter 7 says go. That is in 457 BC that he writes that second letter, which I believe lines up absolutely perfect with 490-year prophecy of the Messiah coming, being born, getting baptized, being killed, and Stephen being killed in Acts chapter 7. That's the end, where there's a dispersion in Acts 8:1 of the gospel going out of Jerusalem. I know that's a massive amount of information, but maybe you'll need to watch this a few times. Ezra is the namesake of this. Of course, he is a skilled scribe. Now, Ezra doesn't come onto the scene until chapter 7. So you'll read Ezra and go, where's Ezra? Well, the first wave is all about Zerubbabel rebuilding, and Artaxerxes with his second letter. See, now you know what that means. His second letter in chapter 7 to rebuild, he sends Ezra in that wave. Ezra is there, and he brings the letter, says, guys, we're good to go. We've green-lighted this thing. Everybody's excited. And Ezra, the skilled scribe, he is a teacher of the law. He confronts the people's sin, particularly in the area of intermarriage with people who believe in more than one God, a pagan, polytheist. You're going to love this outline. Here you go. Chapters 1 through 6 in Ezra is rebuilding the temple. Chapter 7 through 10 is rebuilding the people. Just remember that little simple outline there. First 6 chapters, rebuilding the temple. And then Ezra starts teaching through the law. Ezra, the faithful scribe, starts teaching through the law and teaching why it's bad to marry a pagan and to remain pure before the Lord, and how to stay in covenant with God as 7 through 10. So you have rebuilding temple, building, rebuilding people. Very simple there. I know that's a lot of information. I feel like I just rattle off a lot. But if you can get this information, it will help you tremendously. And you will have this on YouTube to watch a couple times. I'd encourage you to consider the things that were said, because it'll really help you with your overall Bible study. All right, we'll come back at 10:15 and we'll look at Genesis chapter 33.